The file was wrong, not corrupted. Wrong. Archivist Velsharath had processed 14 million stellar surveys in his career, and he knew the difference. Corrupted files had patterns, missing sectors, checksum failures, timestamp drift. This file had none of those things. Every data point was clean, verified, cross-referenced by 3 independent survey drones. The file simply said that no empire had ever attempted to incorporate the third planet of the Sol system. Not failed to incorporate it. Not been repelled from it. Never attempted. Velsharath sat very still in the archive chamber, the blue light of the data wall casting long shadows across the curved walls of the conclave research station. Around him, the hum of 17 different atmospheric processors filled the silence with white noise. Outside the reinforced viewport, the distant smear of the Orion arm stretched like paint dragged across black canvas. He pulled up the file again. Then the corroborating files. Then the meta-survey files that tracked empire expansion patterns across 40,000 years of documented galactic history. Same answer. Every time. 41 space-faring civilizations had emerged within range of Sol. 41 had charted it. 41 had noted the third planet's resources, breathable atmosphere, liquid water oceans, rare mineral deposits, a conveniently positioned moon for tidal stabilization, a magnetic field strong enough to protect a developing biosphere. Not one of them had sent a colonization fleet. The question wasn't whether something was wrong with the file. The question was what had stopped 41 separate civilizations from doing the obvious, rational, profitable thing. In the question underneath that question, the one Velsharath hadn't fully articulated yet, the one sitting at the edge of his thoughts like a shape in fog, was this. If none of them had gone to Earth, then what exactly had Earth done with all that time? The answer, when it began to arrive, did not come from the archive. It came from a distress signal. The Myrith Sovereignty's outer patrol vessel, Enduring Patience, intercepted it 6 weeks after Velsharath's discovery, 17 light-years from Sol at the edge of charted space. The signal was broadcast on a frequency no recognized civilization used anymore. A mechanical radio wave, almost laughably primitive, pulsing in a mathematical sequence that took the Sovereignty's translation engines approximately 4 minutes to identify as deliberate. The message, once decoded, said 3 things. First, we know you're out there. Second, we've known for a long time. Third, we're ready to talk if you are. Patrol Commander Thesek Vor read the decoded message twice. She was a Myrith elder, 4 upper limbs and 2 lower, skin the color of deep ocean sediment, eyes adapted for the low-light conditions of Myrith Prime's northern hemisphere. She had commanded patrol routes for 23 years. She had never received a message like this. Where is the signal originating, she asked. Her signals officer, young and quick, checked 3 times before answering. Sol System, Commander, third planet. Thesek Vor did not respond immediately. The bridge crew of the Enduring Patience maintained the careful stillness that Myrith protocol demanded in ambiguous situations. But she noticed, and filed away for later consideration, that every one of them had stopped what they were doing to look at her. "Send it up the chain," she said finally. "All of it, including the fact that they knew to use a frequency we stopped broadcasting on 400 years ago." She walked back to her command station and did not look at the viewport, though she wanted to. Somewhere behind that viewport, across 17 light-years of vacuum, something on a planet that 41 civilizations had quietly decided to leave alone had just introduced itself. She found, to her significant unease, that she had no framework for deciding whether that was good. The conclave convened in emergency session 7 days after Thesek Vor's report reached the capital. Velsharath was there as a junior archivist, present primarily because he was the one who had pulled the original survey files, and because the senior archivists, in a characteristic failure of curiosity, had initially dismissed his findings as historically anomalous but operationally irrelevant. They had stopped saying that after the message arrived. The council chamber held representatives from 9 civilizations, each translated in real time to the conclave's harmonic interface. The Myrith sat in their elevated section. The Drell, compact, insectile, and precise, occupied the temperature-controlled quadrant to the left. The Vorasethi, the oldest civilization currently seated at the conclave, sat at the center position they had held for 800 years, their representative ancient enough that the translation interface sometimes struggled with the idiomatic drift in their language. The Vorasethi representative spoke first. This was unusual. They rarely spoke first. "We would like to know," the representative said, through a voice that sounded like wind passing through hollow stones, "how the soul species obtain the frequency." Silence. Archivist. The speaker was Conclave Director Maiev Sol, no relation to the star system, simply a naming coincidence that several representatives found quietly unsettling. "You reviewed the archive survey files. When was that frequency last used by any documented civilization?" Bel Sharath checked his notes, though he already knew the answer. 4012 years ago. By the Vorasathi, during their final expansion survey of the Orion periphery. The room was quiet for longer than was comfortable. "That survey passed within 6 light-years of Sol," the Vorasathi representative said. "It was not a question. Yes, and we did not approach the planet. No." The representative's breathing apparatus cycled. "We made that decision for reasons that are recorded in our closed archives. Reasons that are not shared with the broader conclave." A pause. "We will revisit whether that information should remain closed. For now, I suggest that someone go and speak with these humans before they decide that silence is also an answer." The word humans, translated from the Sol System's radio broadcasts, a name they apparently used for themselves, sat in the air of the chamber like a stone dropped in still water. Vel-Sharath wrote it down. He didn't know why. He just felt it was the kind of word that should be written down at the moment of its first use. The mission was approved before the session ended. And because he had been the one to find the file, because he had been the one to sit in a blue-lit archive room and feel the specific wrongness of a pristine record that documented an absence, Vel-Sharath was assigned to the contact team. He spent the transit thinking about what kind of species sends a greeting that says, "We've known for a long time," and then waits. He didn't have a good answer. The contact team's vessel, Measure Discourse, dropped out of transit 17 days later at the edge of the Sol system. Standard protocol: announce presence, establish communication, wait for response before approaching. The response came in 4 minutes. Measured Discourse. This is Dr. Sarah Okafor, representing the United Earth Contact Office. The voice was clear, unhurried, and delivered in fluent Myrith standard, not translated. Spoken. "We've been expecting someone. We'd like to suggest a meeting point at the L4 position of Jupiter's orbit. Coordinates attached. Please approach at your own pace. We understand if you need time." Thesik Bor, who had been assigned as mission commander, stared at the communication console for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, quietly and with the particular flatness that indicated deep professional bewilderment, "They're speaking our language." "Yes, Commander, our language. Not a pidgin. Not machine-translated approximations. Our language. Linguistics confirms native-level fluency, Commander. Idiomatic drift consistent with approximately 40 years of study." 40 years. Thesik Bor looked at Vel-Sharath, who was standing at the secondary console with his writing instrument frozen halfway to his notes, and she said what both of them were thinking. "They've been studying us for 40 years, and they waited to say hello until we came to them." She gave the order to approach the suggested coordinates. What met them at the Jupiter L4 position was not what any of them expected. It was a station, not enormous by conclave standards, modest to the point of humility. Constructed with obvious engineering competence, the structure was built from materials that Bel-Sharath's initial scan identified as partially synthetic and partially salvaged. Refined metals from asteroid captures, polymer composites, and in several sections, what appeared to be raw stone, carved and fitted with a precision that the structural analysis returned as hand-tooled with non-mechanical instruments. They had built parts of the station by hand, and the station had been there, the dating scan confirmed, for 63 years. They built this 63 years ago, Bel-Sharath said aloud. Yes, said the scan operator. Before the enduring patience intercepted their signal. By 47 years, yes. He wrote that down too. They had built a contact station and then waited 47 years for someone to come close enough to use it. Commander, Bel-Sharath said slowly, what does a civilization do for 47 years inside a station they built for a meeting that hasn't happened yet? Thessigvor did not answer. She was already moving toward the docking interface. Dr. Sarah Okafor was shorter than any of the contact team had expected. This was not a significant observation, but it was the first one, and Bel-Sharath noted it because he had learned to note the first observations. They often carried weight that the later, more analytical observations obscured. She was compact, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness that Bel-Sharath associated with either extreme patience or extreme exhaustion. She wore a simple gray garment, no weapons, no environmental suit. She was breathing the station's ambient air, which his suit's analysis confirmed was maintained at a composition slightly richer than Earth-normal oxygen, adjusted, he realized, to be comfortable for a broader range of potential visitors. She had tuned the air in the station for guests who hadn't arrived yet. Welcome, she said, in Myrith Standard. Then, in what the translation interface flagged as Drell Compact formal greeting, she repeated the phrase. Then in Vorasethi Elder Register, which made the Vorasethi cultural liaison go completely motionless for a moment. You speak Elder Register, the liaison said, in that language with the careful tonality that indicated this was not small talk. 17 years of study, Okafor said. My pronunciation is probably still wrong in places. I apologize in advance. It is not wrong, the liaison said. It is precise. A pause. That is more unsettling, not less. Okafor smiled. It was a small expression, but Bel-Sharath found himself studying it. He had reviewed thousands of biological profiles from the Earth radio broadcast during transit. He had seen human facial expressions cataloged and described. But the description had missed something, the way the expression arrived from behind the eyes first and reached the mouth second. Something sequential about it, something that felt like it had been calculated and then decided. I imagine this is strange for you, she said. It's strange for us too, in its way. We've been waiting a long time. How long? Thessigvor asked. Okafor's expression shifted slightly. That, she said, depends on how you're counting. She took them to a room she called the archive room, though its function was immediately obvious even without the name. It was a museum, a history, but not of humanity, of the galaxy. The walls were covered in stellar maps, timeline projections, cultural records, and language databases representing 37 distinct civilizations, not the 9 currently seated at the conclave. 37, including, Bel-Sharath realized with a slow-moving cold that started somewhere behind his eyes and spread outward, at least 6 civilizations he recognized from the conclave's closed archives, civilizations that had collapsed before the current galactic era, whose records were considered fragmentary at best. Humanity had records of dead civilizations that the conclave itself had lost. Where did you get these, he asked. He meant it as a careful professional question. It came out as something else. We listened, Okafor said simply. For a very long time, radio, gravimetric resonance, quantum state echo, whatever we could detect and decode. And we archived everything. She paused. It seemed important to remember things, even things that weren't ours. These civilizations, HFY said, and her voice was doing the flat thing again. Some of them ceased to exist before we had interstellar capability. Yes. How long have humans been capable of receiving interstellar signals? Okafor looked at her with the expression that Vilsharath was beginning to identify as the specifically human expression for when they knew the answer was going to land badly. Passively, about 200 years. Actively enhanced passive listening arrays, about 90, enough to begin piecing together what was out here. She touched the edge of one of the stellar maps gently, like it was fragile. We knew roughly what the neighborhood looked like before we knew how to leave our own system. Thesik Vor's second-in-command, a young tactical officer named Rethvar, who had been maintaining polished, professional silence since they boarded the station, said something that he immediately looked like he wished he hadn't said. "You knew what was out here, and you didn't come out." Okafor looked at him. "No," she said, "we didn't." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense. Vilsharath felt the weight of the unasked question pressing against the room, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived without warning, that Okafor was waiting for them to ask it. He asked it. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Then, we needed to be ready. Ready was not a word Vilsharath had expected, not in that context, not with that tone. He wrote it down and spent a significant portion of the following 48 hours thinking about what it meant. Ready implied unreadiness. It implied a period of deliberate preparation. It implied that humanity had looked at what was outside their system, had decided they were not yet equipped to engage with it, and had then, apparently without conflict or collapse, simply continued building themselves until they were. This alone would have been remarkable. For most civilizations, the discovery of galactic neighbors triggered one of three responses: aggressive expansion, fearful isolation, or catastrophic social fracture. The Conclave's sociological models, refined over thousands of years and millions of data points, held this trifurcation as essentially invariant. You reached out, you pulled back, or you broke apart. Humanity had apparently done none of those things. They had, according to every scrap of evidence in the archive room and everything Vilsharath's team had so far observed, done something that the models had no category for. They had sat very still, learned everything they could, and gotten better. The station's records, which Okafor shared with complete transparency, a transparency that Rethvar quietly flagged as itself suspicious, because civilizations with something to hide rarely volunteered information this freely, revealed that humanity had maintained unbroken contact operations from this station for 63 years. Teams rotating through 18-month cycles. Continuous monitoring. Language study. Cultural analysis. Economic pattern mapping for civilizations they had never directly interacted with. And then Vilsharath found the timestamp. It was buried in the station's maintenance logs, which were thorough to the point of exhaustion. And it didn't make sense. He read it twice, then called up the original source file, then sat back from the console and did the specific thing that Myrith researchers did when they encountered data that their model of the world couldn't accommodate. He held very, very still. The station's first communication log. The first signal ever sent from this facility, the one that the Enduring Patience had intercepted. Its timestamp was not 6 weeks ago. It was the 9th of those signals. The first 8 had been sent at intervals of approximately 4 years, each on slightly different frequencies, each using the most recently observed communication bands of different civilizations. 7 of those signals had, by the station's own logs, apparently passed unnoticed. The 8th had been detected by someone. The station's log showed a contact-acknowledged marker from that signal, but no response. A civilization had heard humanity say, "We're ready to talk," and had said nothing back. And humanity had waited 4 more years and tried again. He found Okafor in the station's central hub, at a workspace covered in what he now recognized as handwritten notes, physical inscription on physical material, a practice that appeared to be a specific human preference rather than a technological limitation. "The signal we intercepted," he said. "It was the 9th attempt." She looked up. "Yes, someone received the 8th. Yes, and didn't respond. No." He waited. She held his gaze with the particular steadiness he was beginning to understand was not coldness, but something else. Something that lived on the other side of patience, past the place where most species ran out of runway. "Who was it?" he asked. "We're not sure," she said. "We have a candidate based on signal return characteristics, but we thought it was better not to make assumptions." She paused. "It didn't change what we were doing. It didn't. Someone received your message and ignored it. Didn't that change the plan?" A small smile. "No, we'd accounted for that possibility." Velsharath stared at her. "You had accounted for the possibility that someone would hear you and choose to say nothing?" "We'd accounted for a lot of possibilities," she said. "That one honestly wasn't in the top 10 of concerning scenarios." "What was?" She tilted her head. The expression she wore was something he now had a rough translation for. Consideration about how much to say, balanced against a decision already made. That transparency was the strategy. "That someone would come," she said, "before we were ready." The phrase landed in Velsharath's mind and sat there. Before we were ready. Present tense implied current readiness, which meant they now believed themselves ready, which meant the 63 years, perhaps the 90 years before that of active listening, perhaps the 200 before that of passive detection, had been building toward a specific threshold that humanity had decided, apparently unilaterally, they had now crossed. He didn't sleep in the Myrith fashion that cycle. He processed instead, which in emotional terms was approximately the same as not sleeping. The next morning in the station's observation room, a curved space where the outer wall had been replaced with a transparent composite that offered an unobstructed view of Jupiter's storm-banded face, Thesicvor found him there. "I sent Rethfar to review the station's structural engineering logs," she said without preamble. "I wanted an assessment of how it was built. And he came back looking like he'd seen something he couldn't classify." She sat beside him. The station wasn't built by a construction crew. It was built by the teams that rotated through it. Every 18-month team contributed a section, over 63 years. The engineering is continuous, but the construction was distributed across time in a way that should produce visible seam failures and structural inconsistencies. But it doesn't. It doesn't. Because each successive team reviewed the previous team's work, identified the weak points, and reinforced them before adding their own section. She paused. Rethvar said it's the most structurally coherent, distributed construction he's encountered, not despite the time span. Because of it. It got better the longer it went on. Velsharath watched Jupiter's great red spot rotate with the vast indifference of a storm that had been spinning for longer than any of humanity's civilizations. "Commander," he said, "the Vorasethi closed archive. The reasons they chose not to approach Sol. I have the same question. Do you think Okofer would know what's in it?" Thesicvor was quiet for a moment. "I think if she knew, she'd tell us. And I think if she told us, it would explain a great deal." She stood. "I'm going to ask the Vorasathi liaison to open it. Formally. Today." She left. Velsharath stayed and watched the storm, and thought about the word ready and what exactly 412-year-old radio frequencies implied about how long humans had been preparing for this specific conversation. The liaison agreed to open the archive. What was in it changed everything. The Vor-Isathi's survey of the Sol system 412 years ago had not been a passing scan. It had been a full assessment mission, 3 vessels, a research team of 67 scholars, and a mission duration of 9 months. The closed archive included their complete observations, and their complete reasoning for the decision not to make contact. The reasoning had one sentence that Velsharath read 4 times. The species of the third planet has achieved written language, agriculture, metallurgy, and organized warfare across 11 distinct cultural lineages simultaneously, has destroyed and rebuilt complex societies across 4 major civilizational collapse events in 3,000 years, and continues to develop without apparent upper bound on behavioral adaptation. We assess that contact at this stage carries unacceptable risk, not because this species is violent, which it is, but because it is becoming something, and we cannot determine what. Still becoming something. Vil-Sharath brought the document to Okafor. He didn't explain. He simply set the translation on her workspace and waited. She read it. He watched her face as she read it. The expression that moved across it was complex and sequential, and he couldn't fully parse it. Not surprise, not quite. Something more internal, like a person confirming something they had long suspected, but never had verified. Still becoming something, she said. Yes, she was quiet for a long moment. That was 400 years ago. Yes, and their assessment was correct at the time. She set the document down. We were still becoming something. She looked at him with an expression he had no prior catalog entry for. We still are. What does that mean? She folded her hands on the workspace. Outside the window, the distant rim of Jupiter was a curved line of orange light. Dr. Tremaltek, Vil-Sharath, how many civilizations in the Conclave's records have gone to 4 major civilizational collapse events and come out the other side? He thought about it carefully. A few, perhaps 6. And how many of those collapsed again after the final event? He thought about it more carefully. All of them. Okafor nodded slowly. We've had 17, she said. Major civilizational collapses. Full structural failures of organized society across our most advanced civilizations. 17 times we lost most of what we'd built and started over. She paused. We got faster at rebuilding each time. And we kept almost everything we'd learned, even when we lost the infrastructure that stored it. We found ways to carry it. Vil-Sharath stared at her. 17, he said. 17. And we stopped losing ground around collapse 12. After that, we were building from a higher floor each time. He did the math involuntarily. 17 collapses. Rebuilding from progressively higher floors. A species that used catastrophe as a ratchet rather than a ceiling. The Vorasethi's assessment came back to him. We cannot determine what. The reason he realized that the Vorasethi couldn't determine what humanity was becoming was that humanity was doing something the Vorasethi had no framework for. They were treating their own failures as infrastructure. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to understand that I'm asking because the answer will affect how the Conclave responds to this contact. Ask. Those 47 years you waited after the station was built, the 9 signals you sent before we came, the 90 years of active listening, the 63 years of rotation teams, the 17 collapses and rebuilds, all of it. He held her gaze. What were you building toward? She looked at him for a long time. And then she said, a version of ourselves we could trust to meet you without either flinching or overreaching. The answer was so simple and so enormous that he had to write it down. He was aware, as he wrote, that his hand was not entirely steady. The contact talks lasted 11 days. On the 3rd day, the Vorasethi liaison asked to review Earth's full historical archive, a request that would normally take months of negotiation between civilizations. Okafor approved it in 4 hours, with the single condition that any information shared would be treated as a mutual exchange. The Conclave would open its own historical records to human researchers in return. On the 4th day, Rethvar, who had initially filed the private note flagging Okafor's transparency as suspicious, revised that note. He filed a second note saying that he had revised his assessment and that the transparency was genuine. He also noted, with the careful phrasing of a junior officer trying to say something significant without overstepping, that genuine transparency at this scale, offered this freely, by a civilization with this level of preparation, was more strategically sophisticated than any amount of deliberate information control would have been. They're not being transparent because they have nothing to hide, he told Desigvor privately. They're being transparent because they've decided openness is the correct long-term strategy, and they have enough competence in their own position that secrecy isn't worth the relationship cost. Desigvor looked at the young officer. When did you arrive at that? When I looked at the historical archive, he said. They have detailed records of 7 civilizations that I identified as having collapsed specifically because they withheld information from their neighbors at the moment of first contact. They used those collapses as case studies. For decades, he paused. Commander, they studied how civilizations fail at contact events and specifically designed their approach to avoid those failure modes. Desigvor stared at him for a moment. Get Vilsharath. On the 7th day, the representative from the Drell Compact, who had been characteristically precise and silent throughout the early discussions, asked a single question that stopped the room. The collapsed civilizations in your archive, the ones that failed, you have records we don't. The Drell representative's compound eyes held no expression, but its posture carried something. Some of those failures, did humanity contribute to them? The silence was total. Okafor did not look away. In 2 cases, she said, human explorers made contact with civilizations in ways that, in retrospect, introduced destabilizing pressures. We had been trying to understand those situations for 80 years. They are part of why we waited. Another pause. They are part of why we needed to be ready. The Drell representative was still. You caused harm. Possibly. We don't know the full causal chain. We believe we did. Okafor's voice remained level. We did not explain that earlier because it is complicated and because we weren't certain you would believe us, that we would volunteer our own failures. But it's in the archive. You'll find it. You put your own culpability in the archive you were going to share with us. Yes. Why? Because, Okafor said, if this relationship is going to work, it needs to be accurate, not favorable. Accurate. The Drell representative was still for 11 seconds, Vilsharath counted, before it said, this is not how civilizations behave at first contact. I know, Okafor said. We weren't sure it was the right call. But we decided that if we were wrong about that, we were wrong about enough else that the relationship was built on a bad foundation anyway. She folded her hands. We didn't want a good first impression. We wanted a real one. Vilsharath requested a private meeting with Okafor on the 9th day. He had a question that he had not raised in the formal sessions, and he had spent 6 days deciding whether to raise it at all. They sat in the observation room with Jupiter still turning outside. The Vorasethi, he said, the civilization that received your 8th signal and didn't answer. She waited. We think it might have been the Vorasethi. She was quiet for a moment. We think so too. They heard you say you were ready. And they chose not to respond. For 4 years. Yes. Do you know why? She looked at Jupiter. We have a theory. We think they were deciding whether we were actually ready, or whether we were claiming to be. A pause. We think the 9th signal was a test they designed, or that they allowed us to give ourselves. A final waiting period they didn't announce, to see if we'd stop or if we'd keep trying. Vilsharath absorbed this. The Vorasethi, the oldest civilization at the conclave table, who had been watching humanity for 400 years from a careful distance, who had specifically closed the archive of their soul survey, who had been the first to speak at the emergency session, who had said, we will revisit whether that information should remain closed. They were protecting you, he said slowly, from galactic contact before you were ready for it, by not answering. That's our theory. By staying silent, they were. Giving us time, she said. Yes. And now they've opened the archive, yes, because you proved something. The 9th signal, 4 years of silence and you tried again. Okafor smiled, the specific smile he had catalogued on day 1, the one that arrived from behind the eyes first. The Vorasethi liaison came to me this morning, she said, privately, before the session. He said something in Elder Register that I'm still working through the full idiomatic weight of, but the closest translation I have is, she paused. The closest translation I have is, you have passed through fire without becoming flame, meaning you survived catastrophe without becoming catastrophic. Velsharath held that in his mind for a long time. 17 collapses. An archive built from other civilizations' failures. 8 ignored signals. 47 years of waiting inside a hand-built station above a gas giant. A history of causing harm and spending decades trying to understand it rather than justify it. Transparency as strategy. Readiness as a threshold. They had decided to define themselves. Pass through fire without becoming flame. What happens now? He asked. Not procedurally. He meant something deeper, and she heard it that way. Now we find out, she said, whether the rest of the galaxy was also waiting for us to be ready, or whether they just didn't know we were coming. She looked out at Jupiter. Either way, we're here. The conclave formalized first contact with humanity 18 months later. Velsharath was there for that session too. He had been promoted by then. The Soul Contact report had done things to his career that he was still slightly uncomfortable with, and he sat in the section normally reserved for senior archivists. The session was significant for many reasons that would be analyzed and documented for centuries. The induction of humanity into the broader galactic community, the formal exchange of historical archives, the trade agreements, the communication protocols, the shared research frameworks. But what Velsharath remembered, what he wrote in his private notes that night, in the specific way he'd learned to write things he suspected were important, was a small moment that didn't make it into the formal record. At the end of the session, the Vor Asathi representative approached Okafor, not during the session, after, in the corridor, in what should have been a transitional moment between formal proceedings. The representative said something to her. Velsharath was close enough to hear but too far to easily translate. His elder register was functional but not fluent. He caught fragments. The phrase, long patience. The phrase, we watched. A third phrase that he couldn't fully parse, something about wait and time, and an untranslatable word he thought might mean something between inheritance and earned. Okafor replied in the same language. Her posture, for just that moment, was different from any posture he had observed from her in 11 days of contact meetings. The careful steadiness was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted. Something had released, like a load transferred. He asked her about it later, at the reception that followed. What did the Vor Asathi say to you? She considered him for a moment. Then, they apologized for not responding to the 8th signal. She looked at her drink. They said they had been watching humanity for 400 years, and they needed to know if we would keep going. Without encouragement. Without confirmation that anyone was listening. She paused. They said they'd heard all 8 signals. He waited. All 8, she said. Not just the 8th. All 8, for 32 years. Velsharath did not say anything for a moment. He thought about the teams that had rotated through the station for 18 months each. Who had sent signals into silence and then handed the station to the next team? Who had done this 9 times across 32 years with no response, no indication that anyone was listening? How do you do that? He asked. How does a civilization keep sending signals into silence for 32 years? Okafor was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice had the quality of something said simply because it was simply true. You decide early, she said, that the absence of an answer isn't the same as the absence of someone to answer. He wrote that down. Later, much later, when the histories were written and the contact event had been analyzed from 100 angles by 100 scholars from a dozen civilizations, the debate would center on what exactly humanity's advantage had been. The competitive edge. The trait or capability or structural feature that had allowed a species to survive 17 civilizational collapses, maintain a 400-year galactic monitoring program, build a contact station by hand over 6 decades, and wait without breaking. The scholars largely agreed that it wasn't technology. Humanity's technology at first contact was advanced, but not exceptional, late tier within the galactic range. It wasn't aggression. Several galactic civilizations had more aggressive expansionary histories. It wasn't intelligence by any standardized measure. The Drell Compact's processing capacity vastly exceeded humanity's, and the Vorasathis' accumulated knowledge was centuries deeper. The most common scholarly conclusion, cited in the Conclave's own retrospective report, authored in part by Velsharath, held that humanity's defining characteristic was this: every other civilizational model in the galactic record reached a point at which the cost of continuing exceeded what the civilization was willing to pay and stopped. Humanity had never identified that point, not in 17 collapses, not in 32 years of silence, not in 400 years of being watched without their knowledge, not in the long preparation period that the Vorasethi had observed as a species still becoming something and had decided, correctly, needed time. The report noted, carefully, with the measured language of formal scholarship, that this was not simply persistence. Persistence implied knowing the end point and choosing to continue toward it. What humanity demonstrated was something more fundamental. They had continued in the absence of visible endpoints, without confirmation of progress, without external validation, without knowing whether the thing they were building toward existed. They had decided that the work mattered before they could prove that it mattered, and they had been right, but only because they had decided it first. That was the line in the report that other civilizations found most difficult to parse. Not the scope of human endurance, but the mechanism of it. They had willed the endpoint into relevance through the act of persisting toward it. Velsharath's private addendum to the report, not included in the official version because his senior colleagues thought it too philosophical for a formal document, read as follows. The Vorasathi asked, 400 years ago, what humanity was still becoming. I believe I have an answer. They were becoming the species that would still be there when you turned around, not because they were certain the turning would happen, because they had decided to be there whether it did or not. I do not know what to call a civilization that practices hope with the rigor of science and the patience of stone. I do not think we have a word for it yet. Perhaps we will make one. In the station above Jupiter, now refurbished and expanded and hosting a permanent conclave liaison office, there was a room that Dr. Okafor had called the archive room. The curved walls still held the original stellar maps and language databases and cultural records that humanity had compiled across 9 decades of listening. A new edition had been mounted beside the entrance. A small plaque installed during the formal contact ceremony, text in 17 languages including Elder Register. Velsharath had written the Myrith version himself. In the human language that he had spent the last 18 months learning, it read simply, "We listened until you came. We will be listening still." Below it, in smaller text, was a date, not the date of the first contact session, not the date the station was built. The date of the first signal ever sent from Earth into the dark, 80 years before the station existed. A raw radio pulse on a quiet frequency, aimed at no specific destination, carrying only a mathematical sequence that said, to anyone who might be listening, we are here, we are thinking, we are reaching. No one had received it. No one had been close enough. But humanity had kept sending and sending and sending in the absolute silence of a galaxy that had for 400 years, and for reasons ranging from careful caution to simple inattention, chosen not to answer. And now here was the station, and here was the plaque. And here was the conclave liaison office humming with activity, and here were the archives open and exchanging in both directions, and here, most implausibly of all, was a species that had spent the longest, quietest, most patient watch in the history of galactic contact, looking at the completed thing, and was not bitter, and was not triumphant, and was not surprised. They had expected to arrive. They had simply been willing to wait until they did. In the observation room on the last night before Velsharath's team returned to the conclave capital, he sat again with Jupiter turning below him and thought about the Vorasesi's phrase, "Pass through fire without becoming flame." He had turned it over many times by then, and he understood it better with each handling. There was something about it that he hadn't written down yet. Not the literal meaning, the survival of catastrophe without becoming catastrophic. Something underneath that. Something about the nature of fire itself. Fire spread by consuming. It grew by taking. A civilization that became flame grew fast and bright and was defined, in the end, by what it had burned. But a civilization that passed through fire, that was refined by it, that used each collapse as a lesson and rebuilt from a higher floor, that civilization carried the heat internally and was warm rather than burning, present rather than consuming. That was what the galaxy had been watching, without fully recognizing it, for 400 years. Not a species rising, a species, over and over and over again, choosing to rise. He thought about the silence. 32 years of signals sent into nothing. 18-month teams rotating through a hand-built station above a gas giant, each one performing maintenance, continuing the logs, sending the next signal, training the next team, and returning to Earth with nothing to show for it except the conviction that the work mattered. He wondered what those teams had told their families when they came home. He wondered what you said to someone who asked, "What did you accomplish up there?" when the honest answer was, "We waited, and we sent, and we kept the station running, and we came home so someone else could do the same." He decided, sitting there, that the honest answer was probably exactly what you said, and that humanity had probably gotten very good at saying it over 3 decades without embarrassment or apology. Without needing the outside world to understand why the waiting was itself the work. There was a word for that, he realized. Not in Myrith, which had 37 words for varieties of patience, but none quite right. Not in the Vorasethi register, which had a word for the patience of geological time, but nothing for the patience of a choice, made daily, to keep going. He opened his notes. He wrote the observation. He wrote the gap where the word should be. And then, in the margin, in the small, careful script he used for things that were not yet finished thoughts, he wrote a single human word that Okafor had used on the second day, in passing, in a sentence about the station's rotation teams, a word she had used simply and without ceremony, as though it needed no explanation. Faith, not the religious variety. Not faith in something external, the internal kind. Faith that the work mattered before proof arrived. Faith maintained across failures and silences and collapses without losing its grip on the original reason. 17 collapses. Rebuilt each time from a higher floor. Because they had kept faith, even with themselves in ruins, with the idea that there was something worth building toward. He looked at Jupiter one last time. Its storm had been spinning for longer than human civilization had existed. Longer than the Myrith, longer than the Drell Compact, perhaps as long as the Vorasethi. It would still be spinning when all their archives had gone quiet. And yet there was a hand-built station above it, and a plaque in 17 languages, and an archive open in both directions, and the species that had spent 400 years being watched while it waited, that had spent 32 years calling into silence while it was heard, that had collapsed 17 times and rebuilt from whatever remained, that had sat with the knowledge of the galaxy outside and chosen not to rush the door until it trusted itself to walk through it. The galaxy had been watching, trying to determine what humanity was still becoming. Vel'Sharath had spent 11 days and 18 months answering that question for his superiors and his colleagues and the formal record. But here, alone, with Jupiter turning beneath him and the dark full of civilizations that had watched and waited and tested and finally opened the door, he let himself write the honest answer. He wrote they were becoming the species that would still be here. Then he closed his notes and sat with the dark and thought that was the most terrifying and the most quietly magnificent thing he had ever had cause to record. Not because humanity was the strongest, not because they were the oldest or the most advanced or the most advanced or the most prepared, but because when the Vorasethi had stayed silent for 32 years to see if humans would stop, humanity had not even considered it, and that, in the end, was the thing no galactic model had contained. The thing the 41 civilizations that had surveyed Sol and turned away had perhaps sensed without fully understanding. The thing that the Bor Asathi had watched for 400 years and expressed, at last, in the corridor after the formal session, in the ancient register of their oldest language, to a short, still-eyed human woman who had learned it in 17 years and spoken it precisely. You cannot wait out a species that has decided waiting is not surrender. You cannot outlast something that has already decided 17 times over, in the ruins of everything it built, that loss is only the foundation of the next attempt. The galaxy had not avoided Earth because humans were dangerous. The galaxy had avoided Earth because somewhere in the deep record of 400 years of careful observation, the oldest civilizations had understood, without being able to fully articulate it, that they were watching something unprecedented, a species failing constantly and completely, in full, in public, across millennia, and choosing, every time, in the silence after the fire, to begin again. And they had not known what to do with that. They still didn't. But the door was open now, and humanity had walked through it the same way they had done everything else, not with power, not with certainty, not with the clean confidence of the unconquered, but with the particular kind of quiet that belongs to something that has been broken so many times it no longer fears the breaking, because it has learned, in the most fundamental and irreversible way, that breaking is not the same as done.